On June 30th of last year, I published a video titled, "Let's Talk About Video Game Preservation," where I did exactly that. I talked about what preservation was, why it's necessary, what it's like to preserve video games, and the future of game preservation itself. 10 months later from when I posted that video game preservation has taken massive hits all across the board. From the Switch emulator Yuzu and 3DS emulator Citra being shut down, the Xbox 360 store scheduled to be shut down in July of this year, us being told we need to get comfortable with not owning our games, the absolute firestorm of events with the Crew's shutdown. It's safe to say we've taken a beating. I feel like we need to have this discussion again. Not because of any fault on consumers. This isn't meant to be a "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed, talk to you all watching for not doing enough" or anything of the like. Rather, this video will be a kind of sequel to the previously mentioned video of mine, where instead of discussing things like what preservation is, the methods, why it's important, etc., I instead want to focus on some factors that have contributed to this current situation and what we can do moving forward. So, let's talk about video game preservation again. Let's get some disclaimers out of the way real quick. This video isn't meant to be a multi-hour summary of every single event on a timeline leading up to the state of gaming today. Rather, this is meant to be a general summary of key points that result in the state of gaming being what it is today. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to be focusing on three main contributing factors in this video: the transition from physical to digital games, a change in perspective as to how those at the top view video games, and lastly, video game shutdowns. The physical versus digital games debate has been going on ever since the concept of digitally downloading games had been fully realized around the early to mid-2010s. Before then, physically owning video games was either the only way to play them if you go back far enough, or the preferred option since digitally purchasing things was still in its infancy. As the rise of digitally buying things started to become more and more mainstream though, this also affected video games. And let's be real with ourselves here. Digitally buying games does have benefits through the convenience of everything. Instead of needing to wait in a long line at your local GameStop in the cold winds of November for a Call of Duty Midnight release, where you'll only be able to play the game an hour or so later considering the line and the drive back home, you could get it digitally and start playing right at midnight without needing to leave the house. If you're in my position of being a college student where you're semi-frequently moving things out of the house and into your dorm or apartment and vice versa, needing to only keep track of the console and not the games as well saves a little bit of a headache there. However, physical ownership of video games has a fair number of advantages despite the convenience that digital ownership can provide. Wait, actually, hang on. There we go. Yeah, you may need to go outside and interact with the public, which for an introvert like myself is a pretty scary thought. Or if you're willing to wait a couple days, you can buy a physical copy of a game online and have it shipped to you. But through all of that social interaction and or waiting, once the game gets to you, you truly own that game. In the event that a game gets pulled from digital stores and you didn't buy it digitally, physical copies of the game still being out there means you can still play it. In the event that the game can't be played digitally for one reason or another, even if you own it as such, physical ownership allows you to pop the disc in and play it that way. Even in the event of an always online DRM or multiplayer exclusive game getting shut down where the disc can only get you to the title screen, something can still be done with that. People can rip the game files and make community servers, for instance, to bring that game back from the dead. Outside of any online connectivity, people can rip the game files so that many years down the line, when official means of purchasing the game are no longer viable, there's still a way to play so it isn't lost to history forever. And companies know this, with the most recent major event in gaming being an indication of that. Ubisoft is full-blown revoking access keys for copies of The Crew, meaning that people can't even get into the game in any capacity in order to, for instance, rip the game files for a possible revival later down the line. To put it simply, digital quote-unquote ownership is a lot more convenient but offers practically no preservation perks, while physical ownership is a little less convenient, but you have a much better toolbox for when it comes to preserving that game. Now, I don't want this to come off as me shaming people for largely buying games digitally. In fact, it would be hypocritical of me to do so. Aside from NASCAR Rivals, all of my current Nintendo Switch library is digital. A large part of my PlayStation 5 library is digital. And do I even need to say anything regarding Steam for my Steam Deck and Xbox Game Pass for my Series X? On top of all that, we can't deny the reality that at some point, companies will most likely stop producing physical versions of games altogether. Regardless of where you stand on the physical versus digital debate, it can't be denied that, barring an extremely unusual chain of events, physical copies of video games will eventually slow down to a halt over the coming years. Companies don't make as much money from physical sales of games. They need to split the money with the store providing the game, they don't make any money from pre-owned sales, and refunds are easier for the consumer. Meanwhile, digitally, there's no brick and mortar store acting as a middleman, there's no such thing as a pre-owned digital video game, and refunds are basically impossible after a purchase. To put it simply, sooner or later, preferably sooner, we'll need to figure out how to preserve games from a digital format on a wider, more grandiose scale. How do we go about doing that? I've got no clue. I know, I'm a furry, which means I'm contractually obligated to be secretly working in the IT industry as a cybersecurity specialist or something, which therefore means I'm contractually obligated to be good with computers and coding and all of that. But do you think I'd be making YouTube videos if I had my life together with a job like that? My point is, I don't know how we would go about doing something like that, but we need to figure something out sooner or later. I would guess that it's a bit easier for PC versions of games, but things like console exclusives, I don't know. Then again, people have figured out how to modify consoles like the original Xbox, the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, etc. before, so it might not be as difficult of an endeavor as I thought? Question mark, because I'm not about to be caught speaking on behalf of people who are leagues smarter than me. If anyone watching does have an idea on how this would all be achieved, please let me and everyone else watching know in the comments below. We're probably going to be needing that knowledge sooner or later. The live service model has become a mainstay for the AAA gaming space nowadays, but I would say that this model, in its current widely adopted form, has severely overstayed its welcome. Back in the day, updates to games were done in the form of major patches for bug fixes, balance changes, or DLC packs back when that was mainstream, but said updates weren't as filled with greed. In the AAA gaming space nowadays, it shouldn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that most video games are seen more so as money generation products rather than products meant to be enjoyed by the consumer. While updates done via the live service model do still contain things like bug fixes, balance updates, etc., they also contain things like updates to the in-game stores. This live service model is often what causes games to launch in an incomplete state. The release it now, fix it later approach, often with the in-game store somehow working just fine while everything else is broken. This is one of the main factors that has gone into this change of perspective of video games in the AAA space. Instead of people looking at a game and finding out ways to make it fun, because that's the only way a game could be profitable back in the day, nowadays lots of games are looked at through how they can be profitable first and then how they can be fun later. This mindset has unfortunately been normalized, and I would argue it's been that way for some time already, but the occasional over-aggressive push happens that causes those plans to be pushed back a bit. Take, for example, the Xbox One. Originally, this thing was meant to always be listening in on you through the Kinect, it wouldn't allow you to share games, it required an active internet connection at all times to even play those games. It was a mess. If you're curious to know more about that, I would recommend Stop Skeletons from Fighting's video on that particular topic. Because of the overly aggressive push, people were more alert and on the lookout for bullshit like that. But over the course of the following years, always online DRM games have become more common. The push for digital purchases of games means things like trading, selling, sharing, etc. aren't as common. Again, games being seen as profitable first and foremost. Of course, people deserve to make money from games. I'm not saying that all of them have to be free. Food needs to be put on the table and the lights need to be kept on. But when greed gets in the way of the fun of a game, that's when we run into issues. In particular, the greed that causes higher-ups to look at video games not just as money generation products, but as disposable money generation products. Video games no longer being available to be purchased or played, either fully or just in parts, isn't anything new. In fact, the exact reasoning as to why isn't anything new either. Whether it be licenses to aircraft in an arcade flight action game, or vehicles in an arcade racing game, a specific licensed song, a game's multiplayer servers not being populated enough to justify the expenses that go into keeping them up, or whatever other reason you can think of, parts of games, or games entirely, depending on if the game was online multiplayer only for instance, would get shut down. All because of corporate greed and those looking at the top for any excuse to cut on expenses in order to make their profits that much larger. But the one major difference is that back then, you would usually still be able to play other parts of these games. Battlefield Bad Company 2 still has its single-player campaign that can be played even though the official multiplayer servers are now shut down. The NASCAR Thunder games still have their single-player modes to be played even if the official means to play multiplayer have been dead for a long while. Ace Combat 6 Fires of Liberation's multiplayer can still technically be played since it relies on peer-to-peer instead of server connections, but you'd need to organize a meetup for an event like that, which is something that most people won't bother to do. In the meantime, the campaign is fully playable. Call of Duty Black Ops 2's multiplayer may be a fiery mess, which really breaks my heart since this is my personal favorite Call of Duty game, but everyone can revisit the campaign, zombies, Mob of the Dead and Origins My Beloved, and even play offline bot matches if they want to get a taste of what the multiplayer was like. Damn, that is a bittersweet thing to say. Compare all of that to the modern gaming era of today. Ace Combat Infinity is entirely dead, with a server connection required to access even the single-player campaign, the one aspect of Infinity that shouldn't require such a thing. What? Although far from dead as of this video, Gran Turismo 7 needs an internet connection to access a lot of the core components of the single player. In the event GT7 servers shut down, unless Polyphony is willing to put out an offline patch like they did with GT Sport, then this game is effectively dead. The Crew, the big hot button game in the gaming space at the moment, is entirely dead. You can't replay the single-player story missions, you can't just freely drive around to your heart's content, hell, you can't even access the game itself with the access keys now being revoked by Ubisoft. On that note, when the inevitable death of The Crew 2 happens, I have a hunch that this game will suffer the same fate. No offline patch to allow you to replay the single-player events, access keys being revoked, the whole 9 yards. Meaning that it'll only be a matter of time until all of our ranks, how many vehicles we've acquired, how many hours we've put into the game, all of that will mean nothing. Companies don't want us to stick with older titles. They want us to just buy the next thing, play that for however long those at the top want to keep it alive, then kill it, have us buy the next thing that comes out, rinse and repeat. Driven by the desire to get as many sales for as many products as possible in the pursuit of making sure each and every year sees growth rather than decline, AAA developing and publishing studios are more focused than ever on their spreadsheets, the dollar signs, and the arrows pointing up rather than the game being fun to play with good sales numbers naturally occurring as a result. This all begs the question then, how do we navigate this? What can we do? Well, there is a movement that's been started a couple weeks ago, one that you can take part in. Accursed Farms is currently having a big movement going on where he's calling on people to reach out to government officials to have them look into the issue of video games being killed off. You can head over to stopkillinggames.com, link will be in the description, select the country that you live in, and you can take the recommended courses of action from there. Outside of that, if you've got the knowledge and capabilities, consider... how do I put this without having the feds knocking on my door? Consider helping with making games easier to acquire. And if you feel comfortable becoming a teacher, please spread that info wherever you can. The more people can obtain such knowledge, the more of a fighting chance we as consumers of the video game industry may have. Be safe if you choose to do this though. Don't get too cocky out there. I'm not responsible should anything happen. If nothing else, then you can still spread the word. As cliche as it sounds, making more people aware of what's going on is always a good thing. I will fully accept being called crazy, paranoid, what have you, but I do think that now is the time to seriously get our asses into gear when it comes to keeping the video games we love to play alive. AAA corporations have already proven that they're only in it for the money now. There may be some exceptions to the rule here and there, but for the most part, AAA gaming has become so infested with greed that it's only a matter of time until those at the top have such insane demands that a gaming crash occurs. Now is the time for all of us to put our collective foot down and say to the AAA industry that enough is enough. Whatever you decide to do, if we can protect the games that we love to play, then it'll all be worth it once we reach the light at the end of this tunnel.